koutou katoa, ko Adrian Miller toko ingoa, ko Mangakiki toko manga, ko whangatiao toko awa, no tamaki makaurau ho, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to welcome you all here today on Thursday the 16th December to this Infrastructure Sustainability Council Levers for Change webinar. Today on sustainable finance and climate-related disclosures, co-hosted with BNZ. Sadly, because we're still in lockdown, it's virtually this time. I'd also like, on behalf of the Infrastructure Sustainability Council and those of our audience joining us from Australia, to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. And we acknowledge their deep connection to land, water and culture, and we pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Administratively, I'd like to reassure you all that your videos and chats are turned off. We're all pretty used to the Zoom functionality now, but please feel free to add questions as they occur to you while the discussion occurs, and we'll come to those in the Q&A part of the agenda. So what's on our agenda today? I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about our Levers for Change Thought Leadership series, of which this is the very first event. And then we'll kick into short speeches from each of our panelists and close out today's session with Q&A from the floor. So our Levers for Change series, it's designed to complement our other thought leadership offerings. These include member-only events and forums and other publicly available webinars, podcasts, conferences, papers and publications. And on that note, I commend those of you interested in hearing more about us to go to our website and record your details there. There's a slide at the end where you can do that. So our Levers for Change is a big picture thought leadership series looking at our changing world and those who are helping us get into gear, build momentum to affect the change required around sustainability and climate change. There's certainly much change in the world right now. Obviously, there's the physical side of things. We need to pay more attention to asset and organisational resilience, as well as the other adaptation and mitigation strategies required in the face of climate change and increasingly more common natural disasters. We are also seeing vast changes in terms of human expectations and in social licence. Customers and the purchasers of services are increasingly not just the passive recipients of goods and services, but more discerning consumers, with expectations not only of the goods and services they buy, but the organisations that produce or supply them. Taxpayers, ratepayers and shareholders have started to develop a conscience about what they pay for and invest in, and hold organisations to account, sometimes even in the courts, when they stray from those expectations. Much has also been written about the responsibility of directors and decision makers. Suffice to say, there are clear conclusions reached that suggest directors' fiduciary duties and the roles of those responsible for designing, building and operating businesses and assets are quite different than they once were. In many cases, the changes in human perceptions and expectations have preceded legal and regulatory change, and we're playing catch up. So turning here today to what we're talking about, which is financial products and climate-related reporting in this rapidly changing landscape. So if I could have that next slide, please, Lauren. Some way ask why we here at the ISC are interested in financial products and climate-related reporting. Well, simply put, our IS rating products can be used to third-party assure performance outcomes for infrastructure assets, networks or portfolios of assets. So turning now to our speakers. So I could have the next slide, please, Lauren. We've already heard about the expectations from investors and other stakeholders alike that reporting moves beyond financials into performance, value, risk and impact, including ESG matters. To date, though that reporting has generally been voluntary and organisations have utilised frameworks and types of reporting that suit their business, and which makes it quite difficult for us to assess them. That's changing, and Amelia Sharman from the XRB is here to tell us how, when it's changing and what impact it will have on you. Similarly, if financiers are seeing the market for products that meet customer needs and address the exposure they and the rest of us will all have physically, financially and legally if change doesn't occur. They are also themselves driving change. We'll hear from Louise Tong of the BNZ on how that's playing out in her space. Then we'll also hear from Kapua Smith at Contact Energy from the perspective of both an issuer and reporting entity. The final piece of the puzzle is institutional investors, and here today we have Philip Houghton-Brown of BT Funds on that part of the landscape. So if we could now turn to Amelia, handing over to you, Amelia. Amelia is the Director of Climate Standards at the XRB. Amelia, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your role, what XRB's work plan is and the timelines that you're working across, and perhaps a little bit about where New Zealand sits in terms of the international trends and how the market is starting to respond to what you've got on your work plan. A fair bit to cover, but if we could hand over to you.
Kia ora koutou, ko Amelia Sharman. I'm really pleased to be here to talk about the XRB's work on climate-related disclosures. So we at the XRB are developing a climate-related disclosure framework, which will require large entities, that's large listed entities and large financial organisations, to provide climate statements to the general public. I'll just give a little bit of our work plan and timeframes, just so everyone is aware of what we're doing. So the standard is going to be based on the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures framework that has 4 thematic areas: governance, risk management, strategy, and metrics and targets, and 11 recommended disclosures underneath that. We're taking that as our base, but we're also looking at a variety of other guidance, TCFD guidance documents and other documents in order to create a standard for New Zealand. We have a statutory obligation to consult, and because this is something new and quite substantial, we are consulting early and widely. We're putting out the governance and risk management draft sections of the proposed standard on the 20th of October for a 4-week consultation period. We'll do the same for the strategy and metrics and targets section of the proposed standard in next year. And then we'll take all of the feedback that we've got from those 2 consultation points to inform our formal exposure draft. And that will go out for a 3-month consultation period in July next year. After that, and in that July 2022 consultation period, we will also be issuing draft versions of the accompanying documents. There is a whole host of stuff that goes around a standard, and one of those that's really important are guidance documents. So the standard itself, we're looking to be quite succinct, ambitious, and principles based. That means it has longevity, but then the guidance that will accompany it will be able to be updated more quickly by the XRB. It can be more detailed, and that will guide reporting entities about how they should look at the disclosures in the standard. The reporting regime takes effect for accounting periods that start on or after the XRB issues the first standard. So we are anticipating issuing the standard in December next year, and entities will be required to disclose according to the standard for any accounting period starting on 1 January 2023. So for example, if a reporting entity has a 1 January to 31 December accounting period, the regime will kick in for that 1 January to 31 December accounting period for 2023, and then they have 4 months after the end of that accounting period to issue their first climate statement. So we are expecting to start seeing climate statements appearing from around April 2024. So in terms of where New Zealand sits in international trends, we are definitely among the pack of first movers. So there is a lot of, work going on in many other jurisdictions to implement mandatory climate-related disclosure requirements. So the UK is working on this. The European Union are developing theirs. Various other stock exchanges are looking at them. The US is looking at this. Canada. But what is also happening at an international level is the development of a proposed international climate-related disclosure standard, and the XRB is staying abreast of these developments. We are very aware that a lot of not only the reporting entities but also the investors to whom these disclosures are of interest don't just operate in New Zealand or in in one jurisdiction. So we are looking very much outside of New Zealand to understand what's happening in Australia and beyond. So far, I have to say, in terms of trends from early adopters, we are having some great response from early voluntary TCFD adopters. They're providing us with some excellent feedback about the processes that they've gone through. But we are aware that for the reporting entities that will fall under this regime, there is a wide variety of understanding about climate change. And we want to ensure that the reporting framework does allow entities to go on a climate reporting journey that's meaningful for them. This is not a compliance exercise. This is something, and this is a really strong message we've heard from early adopters, that is meaningful for entities. It allows them to make better decisions, when they take it seriously. And I'll just start by saying, these are the 3 lessons that we've heard from early adopters. Firstly, explore what you need to do. So get familiar with the terminology around climate risk. There is so much out there. The TCFD's Knowledge Hub is a great place to start. And identify where expert help might be needed to start, kickstart that journey. Secondly, engage. You must form a coalition of willing within your organization with the senior members of your organization. This framework does require oversight at board level. It requires senior management to get involved. It is not just something for one part of an organization to be responsible for. This is bringing together finance, risk, sustainability, core governance, etc. This is something that should be integrated across an organization. And then the third thing I would say is just get started. Measure your footprint. There is no need to wait for the standard to come out to start measuring your footprint. That is a really great way to get started, just to think about where you are on your climate journey. Thanks, Adrian.
Well, look, thanks so much, Amelia, for that very useful information. And on that note, in terms of sort of we ourselves here at the ISC also take a very much multidisciplinary approach to engagement on this. So those thoughts really resonated with me. So turning now, next up, we've got Louise Tong, who is General Manager Toitū Pūtea Sustainable Finance. Louise, can you tell us a little bit about your role and perhaps a little bit about the terminology? Amelia has also touched on that need to be up to date with the terminology and what people are talking about. Not all of those on this call will be as familiar as some will be. So could you update us on that? And then what trends are you seeing here in New Zealand and also offshore? Are there any new or recent developments that you can tell us about? Thanks, Louise.
Sure. Morena tātou. Welcome, everyone. So look, my role is Toitū Pūtea, which translates to sustainable finance at BNZ. I think of it in terms of 3 pillars, and I don't yet have a good name for my first pillar, so feel free to suggest one as I go. So the first pillar of the area of focus of my role is really all about internal and external education on sustainability and sustainable finance. Sort of insights, articles, engaging with key stakeholders to shape the market. We're a partner in the Aotearoa Circle, and as part of that, BNZ engaged with a broad group of other banks and stakeholders to develop, for example, sustainability standards that the finance sector can use for agriculture. So it's called SAFI, Sustainable Agriculture Finance Initiative. So engaging with stakeholders to develop things like that and establishing a presence in the market. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar of what I'm focusing on is really working internally in the bank to integrate ESG and sustainability into everything we do as a bank, into all our processes, into all our decisions, really trying to weave in ESG considerations as well as traditional financial and credit considerations into BAU at the bank. And then the third pillar is sustainable finance transactions. So sort of that perhaps leads into your next question, Adrian, what is sustainable finance? And look, thematic, I'll start with this sort of thematic explanation. So thematically, sustainable finance is funding that aligns with, reflects and supports a borrower's sustainability ambitions. It supports both lenders and borrowers to increase positive environmental and social impacts and reduce negative impacts. So thematically, that's how I describe it. Perhaps it might help if I sort of talk a bit more practically about what that translates to, what that means. And so practically speaking, it's helpful to think of sustainable finance in two broad categories. Two types of transactions being done in the market. One category is called use of proceeds transactions. You may have heard of the likes of green loans, green bonds, social bonds, sustainability bonds. So these are all use of proceeds type transactions. And the label on these transactions reflects that the proceeds from the funding is being invested or spent on environmental or social projects or initiatives or investments. So that's use of proceeds transactions. The second category is called behaviour-based or ESG-linked transactions. And so that's where the proceeds from the funding can be used for any purposes. It's unconstrained, it can be for general corporate purposes. But where the sustainability element comes in is that the pricing, the cost of the funding, the pricing for the debt is quite specifically linked to the borrower's performance against some agreed sustainability targets. And so to avoid, so that's the second category, ESG linked funding. To avoid accusations of greenwashing, both types of lending are done in line with internationally recognised frameworks. Like the climate reporting, it's very principles-based, very high-level based frameworks. So those are things like the green loan principles or the sustainability linked loan principles. And look, if you're interested in learning more, they're very simple, short, I think digestible documents, 3 or 4 pages, and they're available open source online. So you can just Google green loan principles, sustainability linked loan principles, and you can learn a lot more about it just by reading those short documents. And that's what all best practice credible transactions, should follow. In terms of how am I going for time? Okay.
You're fine.
Look, sustainable finance is a relatively new phenomenon. Globally, the first transaction was done back in 2008, and really Europe has been a leader in this market. The first transaction was done here in New Zealand in 2017. And actually my role prior to this was actually at Contact Energy with Kapua Smith, where we obtained green certification for all contacts borrowing. So Kapua is going to talk a little bit about that shortly. So that was one of the very early transactions in the New Zealand market. But look, both globally and domestically, the market is rapidly growing, evolving, and expanding. So both bankers and customers are really having to come up the learning curve very quickly, but there's very fast adoption and a real interest in sustainable finance and how it can support the role that finance can play to support a transition to a more sustainable economy. And I think that sort of focus and urgency has been, driven by things like, for example, COP26. We've seen a lot of sovereigns, so country issuers adopt sustainable finance programs. The IPCC report is another sort of, thing that's added impetus and momentum. And an example of that is the principles for responsible investment and the principles for responsible banking, of which BNZ is a signatory. Globally, the signatories there now represent $160 trillion and growing, and sort of a growing proportion of the market. And these principles actually have real teeth. There are watchdog committees that will come around every signatory, and you'll have to evidence that you are meeting those commitments that relate to principles for responsible banking. Sustainable finance is one way we can evidence that we are meeting those commitments. So working with our customers to help them become more sustainable. A couple of other things I'll just touch on. Look, greater and greater transparency, is another feature, supported by more and more tools and initiatives, and data such as that's being provided by greater climate risk disclosure, which we welcome and embrace. It will be really helpful when it comes to sustainable finance. There's an increased focus on greenwashing. I guess that goes hand in hand with that transparency. We've seen, Standard & Poor's just did a sustainable finance review of a Philip Morris transaction, which has attracted a lot of criticism in market, right? Everything is very visible, and there are a lot of commentators out there watching and commenting where they don't see sort of strong credibility in transactions. So that's really fundamental when you're looking at a sustainable finance transaction. And the final point, you sort of combine that focus on greenwashing, that greater and greater transparency, along with a better and better understanding of the science of climate and broader sustainability. And we're seeing actually a rise of climate and other ESG litigation and activism. And there's some really interesting cases out there. I'd encourage people to have a look at the ExxonMobil case in America, the little engine that could. So a small hedge fund actually succeeding in getting 3 board positions on the ExxonMobil board in order to turn their strategy to something more sustainable. And there's also a really fascinating case in Australia. The Minister for the Environment, an injunction was sought in relation to a decision around a coal mine, and that was taken by 8 teenagers and a nun. Another fascinating case. And I think we'll see more and more of this activism, and consumers and individuals are really empowered by that transparency and increasing societal focus on sustainability.
Thanks, Louise. That's excellent. I couldn't agree more with you, particularly in those last comments. There's a lot of people watching now and will vote with their feet. So I think we'll just perhaps turn to Kapua. And Louise, you very nicely encapsulated an introduction to what Kapua is going to talk to us about. So Kapua, can you tell us about your role, the nature of Contact Energy's Green Finance Program, and what's the internal rationale for that? What advantages are you seeing from a corporate perspective? And also perhaps how you're feeling as a reporting entity in terms of what Amelia's described.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. I just want to acknowledge you in the Indigenous language of New Zealand, particularly because it's Māori Language Week here. And also to you, Adrian, your acknowledgement of the Indigenous people of Australia. I just want to support and recognise the first peoples of that land as well. So, ngā mihi kia koutou. My name is Kapua Smith. I'm the Head of Sustainability at Contact Energy. We're a New Zealand-based electricity generator, as well as an energy solutions retailer. And our whole strategy is built around decarbonising the energy system in New Zealand. And that really is about tackling a significant sustainability issue, which is the issue of climate change. And to give a proof point or to support the demonstration of our commitment to decarbonisation and sustainability, it was really important to Contact that we walk the talk in this area across a range of spaces. So sustainable finance has been a key part of our journey in giving us proof points to our stakeholders that we actually mean what we're saying. And it's about, I guess I heard the talk before around greenwashing. It's something we're very sensitive about and want to make sure that we don't stray into. And so there's a whole lot of work happening in the broader sustainability space, of which sustainable finance has been a key part. What I will say about Contact, and I want to acknowledge Louise, who worked with us at the time, is that we set up our first green borrowing program in 2017. Since that time, we've evolved it. Now all our eligible green debt is in that program, and that's bank debt, commercial paper and term bonds. We also have all of our bank facilities and sustainability linked loans. So that's 7 loans worth a total of 430 mil. And that's the largest collective amount in New Zealand at the moment, as far as I understand. So our journey in the sustainable finance space has taken a few years, but the value of it has been twofold. And I go back to what Louise talked about in terms of the proceeds-based sustainable finance options, as well as the behavioural options. The Green Borrowing Program for us was really about taking a leadership position and providing options and helping leverage our position to grow the market and respond to a growing demand amongst investors who are wanting to use their investment power to support better environmental, better social outcomes. But the sustainability linked loans has really been a key driver in changing behaviour within our organisation around sustainability. It's actually been a game changer in terms of channeling the efforts of the business and focus of the business towards ensuring we're improving our environmental and social impact. So that's been a fantastic change or evolution, I'll say, within our organisation. So awesome benefits to the business. I guess in terms of the commercial benefits that Contact is seeing, we believe there's a multiplier in the market for companies which have higher ESG ratings. We believe there's a benefit for investors in terms of protecting themselves against that broader risk issue that you see. So for example, in the climate change space, you're seeing an increase in demand of transparency, yes, because it's good for the environment, yes, because it's important for our society, but also because investors want to know if you are a resilient business who can stand up to the changes that are facing, our global economy, which includes changes in regulation to things like climate change. That's something we're seeing significantly here in New Zealand, as well as natural resource management change. Can you as a business stand up and be resilient in the face of that change in the short term and the long term? And that's been a real value driver for the business, I guess, in terms of wanting to take a position both in sustainable finance and then more broadly in the ESG space. And I know there was a bit of an explainer earlier around these terms, ESG being environmental, social and governance. It's a term used in the investment space to talk about sustainability, transparency, reporting and reporting tools. So it's probably a nice segue to that last question you asked, Adrian, around the reporting requirements. If you are investor-driven, investors require transparency, not just over your financial performance, but the environmental and social performance of your business as well. And there are a number of global frameworks out there that you can use to provide consistency, comparability, as well as that transparency for your stakeholders to understand how you're performing. And for us, in terms of our sustainable finance program, our ESG performance in our reporting is closely tied into demonstrating our progress on and our commitment to the instruments and standards we're using in that space. So it's quite an important linkage there. We use a number of frameworks internationally, and I'm really excited about the work that Amelia is doing in the climate reporting space, because it is an alphabet soup of different models. You've got your TCFD, you've got your GHG protocol, you've got your GRI, your integrated reporting. All of these are different reporting frameworks that you can use. Contact uses all of them, but to get consistency would be really great. And the other thing I just want to touch on finally is where you are reporting, you should also be seeking assurance, to give assurance to those people reading your data that the data is credible. And that again is about protecting yourself against greenwashing and potentially down the line, challenges to what you're reporting. So it's a really important part. So it's all connected, the reporting, the sustainable finance, as well as advancing the environmental and social outcomes of our businesses. And I'll leave it there. You're on mute, Adrian.
Sorry, I don't know how I muted myself there. Thank you, Kapua. I think there's some really interesting themes and common threads emerging from all of the speakers. This idea around meeting investor demand, internal cultural moves, and the holistic nature and the multidisciplinary paybacks there are for those involved in the space. And really interesting in the assurance and de-risking comments to Kapua. So on the investor demand side, I think we'll now turn to Phil Houghton-Brown. So Phil, if you could tell us a little bit about your role, what you're seeing in the market, and perhaps something on the need for asset managers to have a stewardship program. I know that's a hot issue for you personally, and you've been quite an advocate for that. So if we could hand over to you. Have we got Phil there?
Hello. Yes, so tēnā koutou katoa, and thanks, Adrian. I assume you can hear me. I've been having a few technical problems this morning.
Can hear you, Phil.
Good, even if you can't see me. So I'm going to be talking from the perspective of being a fund manager and a default KiwiSaver provider. At BT, we believe we've got a significant capacity to drive positive impact and prosperity, not just for our customers, but also, our communities and the environment. That's really our vision in a nutshell. And we're working hard to get there, like others sort of talked about this morning. It's a journey that we're on. So, taking account of ESG, environmental, social and governance risks and opportunities is a crucial part of our investment process. As we all know, climate change in particular presents both physical risks to assets and supply chains and infrastructure, as well as transitional risks and opportunities, depending on whether companies adjust rapidly enough as the economy decarbonizes. So at BT, we've committed to aligning our funds to a 1.5 degree future by reaching net zero emissions from all the investments held in the portfolios. Now, it's worth sort of looking back a little bit. The industry and the media in New Zealand have been for some time mostly focused on exclusions or negative screening, kind of understandably, because it's simple for investors to understand. And it makes great headlines when somebody's caught out holding something. So, but really, it's important to recognize that once you divest from a company, you're really losing the ability to influence them as a share or a bond holder. So we think that being an active owner is the key to driving change. This is also known as stewardship. It encompasses a range of activities, including exercising voting rights, shareholder resolutions, and engagement with directors or management, which can be done, either in a sort of high-profile public way or more privately, and it can be with issuers of both equities and debt. So, we want to drive positive ESG impacts by engaging with companies directly, and also with the specialist investment managers that we delegate to. And some of them are large, global investors who carry a lot of weight. And so, that can be, engagement can be even more effective when investors collaborate and deliver a consistent and constructive message to companies, or even indeed entire sectors. So some large groups of investors and asset owners have formed with a very powerful voice to advocate for and drive change. As an example, earlier this year, BT joined the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative and also the Climate Action 100+. And that group itself brings together, at the last count, I think 575 investors around the world, representing a total of about $54 trillion in assets, to engage with the world's 100 plus largest carbon emitters. And it advocates for improved climate risk disclosures by investee companies in line with the TCFD. And now even closer to home, there's now a New Zealand Aotearoa Climate Change Coalition of investment managers and asset owners, which is starting to form. But talking about the alphabet soup, which was referred to before, I think, by Kapua, it's very much the same with these collaborative groups. There's quite a few of them forming, and lots of extra sort of acronyms to remember. So, in looking back to New Zealand, many of you be aware that the Aotearoa Circle's Sustainable Finance Forum released a roadmap for a sustainable financial system by 2030 in New Zealand, and Louise touched on the forum before. So one of the actions proposed was the establishment of a New Zealand Stewardship Code for investors and asset owners. And I think this would be a really positive step. Stewardship is about how investors behave when engaging with corporates. And so a code, I think, would help a broader range of investors engage more effectively. And certainly, pretty much all developed countries have introduced a stewardship code in different ways or different forms. So I think it would lead to more transparency on a few levels, for environmental, social, and governance risks and opportunities. So you need, first of all, you need asset owners and fund managers to be actively seeking this information from real economy companies so that they can gain decision useful information. It also helps companies, the companies that are issuing the investments understand better what investors are looking for from them. And then thirdly, also it enables funds to be more transparent with their investors, so the investors in turn can also have decision useful information about the funds that they're investing in. And then of course, having that sort of transparency at a company level then enables the funds to be able to comply with, with the new regulations, that have been talked about earlier. So just to reiterate, investors have a critical role to play in changing the behaviours of companies that they invest in through engagement, but also, of course, directing capital towards those companies that can demonstrably have a positive ESG impact, including those that can benefit from climate transition opportunities. And I'll just finish up briefly, how the market is responding to this engagement and stewardship, and has been quite successful. There's at increasing companies' climate disclosures, and obviously it's a combination of that engagement and the regulatory pressure, or the introduction of regulations that Amelia touched on. Each year there's more and more climate-related shareholder proposals being filed, and with some pretty high-profile successes, and Louise mentioned some of those with the oil majors. Just in terms of the world large cap developed markets, about 3/4 of companies now are actually disclosing emissions in different ways. And in New Zealand now, the NZX 50, just over 2/3 of those listed companies are disclosing emissions, although it's fair to say that the reporting quality is still quite variable. And obviously that's where the benefit of the standards when they're released will help in terms of developing that standardization. Finally, just outside of the large cap world, the large company world, disclosures are not as good. So if we looked at the widest possible universe of 13,000 equity and debt issuers around the world, it's only about 30%. So there's certainly room to improve globally, but also to start introducing scope 3 emissions, because most of it is focused on scope 1 and 2. So I'll finish up there, Adrian, and hand back to you.
Okay, thanks, Phil. I think that my microphone's back. Thank you very much for those comments, really interesting, the variability of the reporting quality and what's actually driving the behaviour in the market. Before we actually go to general questions, I've actually got a question for you around the collaborative investor engagement groups. You mentioned some, I think, but are there any other examples you'd like to mention? Or
just very briefly, because it's, I think relevant to the audience. A bit closer to home for the infrastructure sector. So another collaborative group, the IIGCC, which is institutional investors globally, recently published a couple of days ago the first global sector strategy. So this was specifically for the steel industry. So following 12 months of dialogue with consultants, investors and steel companies that were engaged through the Climate Action 100 Plus, the report outlines specific challenges the sector faces in closing the gap to net zero, and proposes actions that companies and the industry collectively and investors can take to address these. So now they're moving to an implementation phase, which will begin through sort of globally coordinated sector-wide engagement process with steel companies engaged through the Climate Action 100 initiative. So essentially sort of that'll enable investors to, it's obviously a very constructive process, and helps sort of, create the right market signals as well.
Great, thanks, Phil. I think that's a great answer, and really interested to hear those recent developments internationally. So I'm just looking here at the Q&A, and actually given the thread that we've had around kind of internal culture change, there's a really interesting question here from Alice Bray in the space around what we might learn from what's happened in the sustainable finance space and how we might apply that to government investment and funding and even sustainable procurement. So I'm happy to throw that open to any of the panelists who are willing and interested in answering that. That's a cross-functional question. Would anybody like to answer that? Perhaps you, Louise.
Yep,
sure. You have a view on that?
Hi. I can answer, give a start of a 10, and then others can perhaps chime in. So a couple of things. I saw that question. It's a great question. I've jotted down a couple of thoughts in response. Or three actually. So the first one is be one of the stakeholders that shows that you care about ESG and sustainability. I did talk to a customer the other day, and they were tendering for a government contract, and I understand that 30% of the weighting of the decision as to who was awarded the contract was based on the ESG credentials of that customer. And so the more stakeholders that demonstrate clearly by doing something like that ESG matters to them, the better, and that might be the thing that spurs that customer on to green their operations, and then they can reflect that in their funding, or we can support them to green their operations using behaviour-based or ESG-linked funding, for example. So that was one point. The second point was, as a government entity, I guess it helps, and I actually have had a look at a number of government organisations, and I think there is pretty good maturity in terms of sustainability, but follow best practice sustainability, understanding your impacts, disclosing them, and look, ultimately that may perhaps support a government financing program, so government bonds that are labelled that reflect the positive sustainability impacts of the various initiatives going on across government, and that will require really good understanding and information on impacts and where money is being spent and what the environmental and social impacts are of those. And then, the third point I had was that, Kāinga Ora is an example of a government organisation that is already actually reflecting its positive social and environmental impacts through its own funding program. So Kāinga Ora have a sustainability bond program that reflects both the social impact of their social housing that they provide, but also, that they are building to high quality environmental standards with their new housing, and it's reflecting that as well. So that's a very sort of live example of an entity reflecting their sustainability work with their own specific financing.
Great, thank you, Louise, for that. Would any of the other panelists like to say something? I think Kapa would like to say something.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. There's a couple of themes, I think, that I've noticed just working in the sustainable finance space, which I think are relevant to sustainable procurement in particular. So one is the approach to avoid versus the approach to invest in impact is something that I would like businesses to think about. Rather than avoiding businesses that are doing bad, so to speak, how do we lean into our procurement processes and our supply chain to encourage changes in behaviour and invest in impact, which is something that I've picked up from the sustainable finance work that's been going on. The other thing is around transparency, another theme in the sustainable finance space. It's really about transparency of your impacts. So when you are purchasing something, or when you are a supplier to someone, how do you support the transparency over not just your pricing, but your environmental and social impacts more broadly? And what are you doing as a buyer to encourage, and for smaller business, support them to provide that transparency to you.
That's great, Kapua. Thank you. I think those signals are really, really important. Amelia, I think you maybe wanted to say something on this too. I can chuck it to you. We have actually got some other great questions too. You're fine.
Happy to move on to other questions.
Well, one we've got here, which I'm quite interested in well, there's actually two here that are quite interesting. We're going to be doing well to get through all these. A question for Amelia around standards evolving and catering for smaller organisations. And so it's just interested in, obviously we've got the larger organisations currently directly impacted by your standards, but how will that affect the smaller ones?
I think the standard as it currently sits will absolutely affect smaller entities now through the requirement for these large financial organisations to report their emissions. So we are looking at the requirements for, as Philip talked about, Scope 3 emissions. So for a financial organisation, they are also sometimes called financed emissions. So they're the emissions in the investments that the bank or the fund, etc., makes. And so that will mean that these smaller entities, again, will need to understand their emissions so that they can be fed back up the chain. I really do see GHG emissions data as being a fundamental piece of organisational data going forward. I think it is just as fundamental as any other bit of your reporting and the capturing of information. In terms of the standard itself, as I said, the standard is looking to be quite principles-based. It is, it's not specifying levels of performance. It is specifying disclosures that entities must make. So actually, I do think it is reasonably applicable for a whole host of entities. We are, as I said, we're very aware that entities are at very different stages on their reporting journeys. A smaller entity might actually be at a much more advanced stage than a larger entity. We do want to, think about how the reporting, the disclosures are, relevant for different types of entities. And so something that we are looking to release alongside the standard. You might have seen it on the slide that I put up, are what we're calling transitional provisions. And so that's realizing that not all entities are going to be able to do all of the disclosures from the get-go, and that there will be some kind of adoption relief from all of the requirements to the as we go forward. Scope 3 emissions is something we're looking really closely at on that front.
Thanks, Amelia. I think really interesting too, the comments that have been made by Kapua and also Louise, and to some extent Phil as well, around actively getting on board and starting your journey actually being an opportunity rather than a risk mitigation strategy. So it can actually be something that helps you win work. So it's not just about compliance costs going up, but actually winning the work to begin with. So there's a really great question here I'd like to ask about whether the RBNZ needs to do more to incentivise banks to originate green products, say via risk-weighted discounts for green assets. So I'm happy to chuck that to the floor, whoever would like to answer that.
I might jump in. I just had something quickly on the last question, actually. So BNZ, along with a whole suite of other organisations, have collaborated to stand up a climate action toolbox, which helps SMEs particularly, but any organisation, but it's focused on helping SMEs understand, measure, and then manage their footprint. And I think that's an example of one of the kinds of tools that you're going to see, being developed that help address that. That mass market. We are a country of SMEs, really. So I think there will be more and more tools and initiatives that help that sector, easily get a grasp on their emissions, because, as Amelia said, it's going to be the key area of focus for the next wee while. On the Reserve Bank, short answer, yes, that will be. And look, I know the Reserve Bank are looking, they do have a team that's looking at climate risk. I think to the extent it perhaps is at some point in the future brought into their risk weighting considerations, it will be a very, very powerful tool that, that will have even impact, across the sector, and so all banks will be sort of focused on it if it becomes sort of is definitively brought into risk weighting and capital considerations. And I think you'll get very sort of swift action and response. Not that the banks are sitting waiting for that to happen, but I think it would be a powerful additional lever.
Great. Anybody else want to add anything to that? There's also another great question here about greenwashing I'd like to ask, and it actually goes to the capability skill sets of sustainability experienced professionals and the extent to which, so I might ask the question, it's quite a long question, but the question is, I've seen the issue of ESG credential greenwashing surface recently regarding ESG professionals not having sufficient sustainability experience to implement their roles. Do you think this is true? And does it mean that these sustainability professionals need to upskill in ESG and finance to better technically support what's going on? So are you seeing a gap there in capability in those implementing programs?
I have a view on this, having worked in this role for a few years now, almost 8, which is sustainability is so big and it crosses so many different spaces, and sustainable finance is this much of it. Like we're working across natural resource management, trying to identify how we reduce our impacts through the way we're building new plant. For example, we're looking at social impacts. We're looking at the sustainable finance. We're looking at influencing different stakeholder groups to come on board to drive change within an organisation. So it's really difficult to put your finger on what exactly is the right skill set in this space, other than to say, what I will say is ESG reporting, sustainability reporting, and sustainable finance is its own particular area where you do need some expertise and skill. And I would suggest it's an additional component to any sustainability program within an organisation, because to me it's about the reporting side, the transparency to your stakeholders, sitting alongside the actual investment into the impact and change initiatives that your organisation is doing. So that's how I would frame it up in that space, but it is so large. It goes across so many areas, so it's really quite an interesting space to work in if anyone is looking.
Yeah,
yes.
Look, I think there is some truth to that question. I actually did engineering quite a while ago, and I tried to do environmental engineering, and there was only one paper, and that lecturer went on sabbatical. And I managed to find one paper at Lincoln University, which I did, but there wasn't, when I was at university, there wasn't anything that looked like sustainability, certainly not sustainable finance. But I know there is a whole centre at the University of Otago. The University of Waikato just announced they're offering a world first, I think they said, Bachelor of Climate Change. So there are more, I'm really excited about the talent that's going to be coming out of our university, and the research actually that's going to be coming out of our universities. It will be very welcome. I think, when it comes to climate reporting, there's going to need to be a lot more skilled resource, coming to market. Probably a lot of us that, have worked in sustainability and sustainable finance have learnt, on the tools, if you like. There are lots of courses out there, but there has been a lot of on-the-job training, I would say, but there'll be more technical qualifications, coming to market as we speak.
Great, thank you very much, Louise. And I think you touched on also a really interesting point there, which is the smaller kind of micro credentials. So as we look to perhaps upskill other disciplines, say the risk team or whatever, who may be looking to move into the space, there's increasingly more product offerings there, and it is really encouraging to see the emergence of those degree courses that are dedicated to this area. So really interesting. Yeah. So I'm just having a quick scroll back through the questions here.
I'm really having a look. Sorry, there was one more thing I should have said. I think you're seeing in sustainable finance in particular the emergence of sort of partnering and hiring in talent in sustainability. Sustainable finance people are not, I'm not Kapua, she's a sustainability expert, I'm a sustainable finance expert. But we have just hired, for example, someone with, experience in sustainability. So, they've worked in, Jackie's worked at IKEA and in Europe in sustainability in a corporate environment. So her and I sort of partner together to bring that sustainability expertise within the bank. So
that's great. And there's a question here from Ben Mason I'd kind of like to ask, which is articulated this way: do you think that in practice TCFD includes enough financial disclosures as opposed to risk identification or reporting emissions? So and I think what he means there, if I can rephrase, is the financial exposure element of shortcomings. So what you're doing positively, but what the downside might be too. I think that's what Ben's asking. Amelia, maybe you could.
Yeah, sure. TCFD, as I said before, is all about integrating and understanding of climate risk and opportunities across an organisation. Absolutely, an entity could integrate their risk into a financial metric. So, for example, we are hearing from auditors in Australia that they are looking to see on the financial balance sheet a reflection of the climate risks that have been identified as part of the TCFD reporting. For example, in New Zealand, you could take an emissions trading scheme liability, and if you saw that as a climate risk and that is not reflected on your your future balance sheet, then that might be something an investor thinks should be material information that you should be disclosing. We are absolutely at the moment, as we're developing our standard, looking to think about how much we would be expecting or requiring entities to provide that financial integration, but it is more than just finance. There are a lot of ways an enterprise can create a value beyond strictly financial metrics. So yeah, I think it's a great question and something that we are looking at right now.
And perhaps Adrian, if I could just jump in.
Yeah, sure, Phil, go. That would be great.
I mean, in terms of from an investor's perspective, and this sort of also relates to the previous question, the scenario analysis part of the TCFD reporting, is the most challenging, because it really does sort of lie at the heart of sort of climate science and climate economics and capital markets. And so, that is going to be challenging, and there aren't a lot of places that investors can go to get sort of advice on that without sort of paying a lot of money to do that. And so, that's partly why we brought in a specialist sustainability expert into our team earlier this year. And but I think that needs to be recognised that it's probably the most useful part of reporting, but it's also going to be the most sort of challenging to do because of all those different facets.
Well, we've also got you still, Phil. I might just ask you something that I myself was wondering, which is I was intrigued by your comments, which were essentially you have a greater ability to influence when you stay in the tent. So you actually might actively decide as an investor to remain in to influence. So I'm really interested in whether you might tease that out just a little bit. We've got just 2 minutes left. So a comment on that would be great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, it's, we have negative screening in our portfolios. There are some hard lines that, we don't want to cross, very, similar to much of the industry. But certainly, the preference is to remain invested and to engage. And some of the most effective engagement that we've seen globally has actually been from what would be described as passive managers, because they have, very large sums of money invested, and they remain invested for a long time. They're not sort of buying and selling in and out of companies, and therefore, for the last decade, they've developed really strong stewardship program. And so we can see that there's real sort of benefits to remaining invested, and that is our preference. Divestment is sort of seen as a last resort.
Right. So what I might do is if we've got literally a minute left, so I might just give each of the panelists the chance to say what they would ideally like to leave as a parting message to what those on the call can do to actually affect change in the space. What can we remove, change, whatever. So handing over to you all in whatever order you wish to speak.
I'll go quickly just to say, please engage with the XRB on the development of our standard. Our first consultation document is 20th of October. Follow us on LinkedIn, look at our website. We're really, really keen to hear your views on how we can make the standard work best for New Zealand.
Thanks, Amelia. Kapua, do you want to?
Yep, kia ora everyone. I guess the key takeaway from me is the importance of having an alignment between the initiatives that you do in this space and your strategy and your outcomes that you're seeking for the environment and society. When it comes to ESG reporting, for example, I think there's a lot of tendency to focus on the reporting as if that's the outcome. And it's actually not. It's about the impact you're delivering and actually ensuring you have a line of sight between that impact and the stuff is really important. That's my parting message. Thank you for having me.
Great, thanks, Kapua. I think that's really important. Keep your eye on the impact. Philip.
Probably I'd just simply say, and commit, engage and collaborate. And, that's at 3 levels. It's the companies we're investing in, it's the asset managers and asset owners, and it's our customers that we're managing the funds on behalf of. And so you really have to have that transparency between all 3 and, a strong sort of engagement going on between all three parts of that equation.
Thanks, Philip. That's a great comment. And Louise, if we could just pass to you for your parting comments too.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, look, I would encourage anyone looking at sustainability in their organisation to get the foundations right and really focus on credibility. You can't get anywhere without that. It's hard, it takes time, and it does require, really think about the resource that you need. It does require proper resourcing. And when the time is right, when you've got your foundations right and you've got clarity and you're understanding your impacts, then come and talk to your bank. Banks and investors and the finance sector focus on sustainability and ESG is only going to increase. So yeah, but we are ready and willing to partner with our customers to have those positive impacts. Great
comments. Okay, guys, look, I think we'll probably call things to a close there. I'd just like to thank all of our audience for joining us today, and also thank our speakers, Amelia Sharman of the XRB, Louise Tong of the BNZ, Kapua Smith of Contact Energy, and Philip Houghton Brown of BT Funds Management. So thanks everybody for joining us today. Great session.